Studying the history of nursing sheds light onto our current nursing systems and helps solidify the understandings of nursing values and procedures. Throughout this presentation, you're going to learn about the most important aspects of trends, events, persons, and public perceptions of nursing between 1941 and 1950 from us, Savanna Smucker, Samantha Pangel, Olivia Scharf, and Kaitlyn Farah.
Nursing in the 1940s endured a lot of changes within the education system, healthcare, and rights for African Americans, largely in part due to World War II. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, starting the involvement of the U.S. in the war. 2,403 Americans were killed, and military and civilian nurses at Pearl Harbor showed heroic bravery as they cared for the injured. Beginning at Pearl Harbor and occurring for several years after, nurses were called upon in mass numbers to help save their country from the atrocities of the war. By the end of the war in 1945, over 77,000 nurses joined the military services. However, at the time, 25% of the entire nurse population was used for the war, posing serious nursing needs of the civilian population. To fix the shortage of nurses, hospitals directed their efforts at expanding the educational system. At the time, in 1940, the nursing educational system had hospital-based schools of nursing where they taught students the skills of nursing while at the same time using them to help with the majority of patient care. Hospitals hoped to help with the nursing shortage by simply admitting more students into their hospitals. However, this was not that easy for them. The traditional population of nursing students was the same group recruited by the war. For nurses who were eager to help with the war immediately, 3 years of nursing school did not sound appealing to them. Also, poor working conditions such as low salaries and long hours made nursing a very unattractive field. In 1943, the Bolton Act created the United States Cadet Nurse Corps. This federal nurse education program provided $160 million for nurse education funding and financial support for nursing students. It gave nursing students a free education as well as benefits such as monthly stipends and uniforms. Its purpose was to increase the number of nursing students and shorten the years of schooling required to complete a nursing program. Increasing the number of students could allow more registered nurses to be available for the military without disrupting hospital care. Although the Cadet Nurse Corps was terminated in 1948, 125,000 Cadet Corps nurses graduated, and 80% of nursing students provided in-hospital care during the war years. With the amount of work the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps put into the war, they were receiving very few benefits. So on June 22, 1944, Congress passed a law providing these members with a temporary officer's rank. For the duration of the war, they were entitled to the same initial pay, allowances, rights, benefits, and privileges as commissioned officers. Another significant change occurring in the nursing profession during the war was the rise of licensed practical nurses, LPNs, and nurses' aides. LPNs were nurses who attended short, one-year programs who carried out basic nursing skills under the supervision of a registered nurse. LPNs appeared to hospital administrators because it cost less to train LPNs and they were able to obtain more nurses fast. Another event that took place in the 1940s was the granting of African Americans into the American Nurses Association. Beginning in 1942 at the Biennial Convention of the ANA, a plan was initiated to eventually allow consideration of all African American nurses to be members of the organization. Finally, by 1948, the ANA allowed for direct membership of African American nurses, even those who lived in states with discriminatory practices. Estelle Macy Osborne was the first African American nurse to be elected to the association's board of directors.
From 1941 to 1950, the United States' nursing field had numerous influential groups and individuals. Some of the most noteworthy advances and accomplishments came from 7 major groups. Among the major groups, the 2 most significant groups were the U.S. Cadet Nursing Corps and the American Nurses Association. The U.S. Cadet Nursing Corps was active from 1944 to 1984. During this time, their goal was to train American nurses during World War II. The Cadet Nursing Corps had over 1,250 training programs across the United States and was the largest and youngest group of women to serve their country. The nurses, often as young as 19 years of age, served on the home front. They would often care for the wounded soldiers who came from fighting overseas in civilian and military hospitals and in public health clinics. The second most influential group from 1941 to 1950 was the American Nurses Association, or the ANA. The goal of the ANA is to build a spirit of solidarity and action while sharing the story of individual nurses everywhere. The ANA has allowed nurses to have a collective voice since it was founded in 1896 and still does to this day. One profound example of this was during World War II. While the number of nurses in active duty was already increasing, President Roosevelt proposed to draft more nurses into military services. However, in 1945, the ANA chose to intensify the recruit for nurses into military services as an alternative to drafting. Another important achievement of the ANA was in 1946, with the endorsement of the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, and the elimination of the discrimination against minority groups. While the impact of the groups from 1941 to 1950 is clear, there are countless nurses who gained recognition for their efforts and had an impact on the nursing field. Some of these nurses being Jane Kendi, Colonel Ruby Bradley, Esther Lucille Brown, Lucille Petrie, and Estelle Macy Osborne. While all these women had a tremendous impact on nursing as a whole, Jane Kendi's story is particularly moving. Jane Kendi was a 22-year-old Navy nurse in 1945 when she and her fellow flight nurses evacuated 2,939 Marines and sailors from Iwo Jima, Japan. Despite never receiving medals for their service, Kendi's heart remained humble. She was quoted saying, "Our rewards are wan smiles, a slow nod of appreciation, a gesture, a word. Accolades greater and more heartwarming than any medal."
Now to the trends. Nurses during the 1940s to the 1950s were typically young, white females with a secondary education. There was a great shortage of nurses in the beginning of this era due to the poor working conditions. If working at a hospital, they were required to live on the hospital grounds, work long hours, and often for little pay. It was not until the U.S. got involved in World War II and the Red Cross began recruiting nurses to work for the war effort did the numbers and interest in nursing increase. This paved the way for military nursing that allowed for women to be sent to the front lines. This served as a tangible and appealing way to contribute to the war effort. With this increasing interest, many civilian women would take short training classes to learn the basis of bedside care, despite their lack of proper degree. Even with that increased form of speedy education and the growing interest, a nurse draft bill was still proposed in order to recruit more nurses, but was not completed due to the war's end. After returning from the war, the practice of nursing declined once again because many nurses were burnt out, taking needed vacations, pursuing further education, as well as getting married or retiring. To combat this decline, new recruitment programs were created, education was expanded, and hospital working conditions were improved. Now to the most iconic trend, the nursing uniform. If enlisted in the war effort, these ladies would wear a uniform based off the branch in which they served. In the Army, they would wear olive green dresses and caps with a tan shirt and scarf. In the Navy, they wore blue dresses with striped sleeves, white caps, and scarves. In the Red Cross, they wore white dresses and caps with a navy blue wool cape. They typically wore a pop of lip color and their long hair was often pinned up around their faces. Overall, these nurses were considered heroines of the era and were known for their bravery, courage, and commitment.
From 1941 to 1950, there were many discernible trends in the public perception of nurses. In 1941, with the United States entering World War II, an emergency health and sanitation bill was passed, which required the immediate recruitment of 90 nurses, with an overall hire of 115 nurses. An influx of money was also required, with $1.8 million earmarked for nursing education specifically. Clearly, at this time, nurses were viewed as something of angels, desperately needed at every military base. Army doctors and patients praised the work of nurses, even admitting that the women were calmer than the men in the first rush of casualties. Nurses provided a touch of femininity and an ever-raging war background, which supplied wounded soldiers with a sense of confidence and security. However, as the war began to subside, so did the popularity of nursing. Towards the end of the 40s, the initial obsession with nurses ended. In fact, many nurses that served during the war did not return to their regular hospital duties after the fact. Nurses were no longer in high demand, salaries were low, and the public began to scrutinize them, treating them poorly and scolding them to get off their high horses and do the work they signed up for. Nursing leaders desperately looked to the federal government for proper funding and assistance to end the nursing shortage. But as the mood of Americans turned sour, government aid was thwarted. In just one decade, nurses in the United States went from heroic to hated, and thus, for this reason, along with others previously mentioned by Liv, most women avoided the field. This general trend can also be seen worldwide in war-stricken countries at this time. In places like Denmark, nurses continued to have an extreme religious impact on patients as they held true to Catholic backgrounds and continued the funding of Catholic nursing orders. Overall, the perception of nurses underwent major shifts throughout this decade.